No, not really. I don't believe I've played for a super team.
He's on a super team. You got Drew Holiday, you got a closing Middleton. He's the most dominant player that I've seen in a long time.
Because so with the Lakers 2020 team, were their super team?
Were they?
I'm asking.
Oh, absolutely.
So what makes them super?
How about two of the top 5 players in the league?
So Shaq and Kobe were a super team. Nobody ever called Shaq and Kobe a super team. They called them a dynamic duo.
So over the past couple of years, the NBA has changed a lot. More perimeter play, more three-point shooting, and in terms of today's video, more player movement. And in particular, star caliber players are moving from team to team at a historic rate. Dating back to 1989 all the way to 2008, there was a grand total of 18 All-NBA players who changed teams during the offseason. Compare that to the 21 All-NBA players that changed teams between 2009 and 2019 during the offseason, and you'll clearly see that the numbers have not only increased, but they've done so within half of the time. And of course, several different conversations have been birthed thanks to this level of player movement. And the one conversation that I want to focus on in today's video is the concept of super teams. Now, super teams have always existed in NBA history. One of the more dominant super teams in league history that people just casually overlook are the 83 76ers. A prime Moses Malone, who just got off of an MVP campaign, joined a Sixers team that not only just made it to the NBA Finals and took the Lakers to 6, but more importantly, featured Dr. J, who was just 2 years removed from an MVP caliber season himself, as well as a few other Hall of Famers who were all in their prime. That Philadelphia 76ers team was so dominant that Moses Malone iconically predicted that they were going to have a perfect record in the playoffs, which they nearly did en route of winning a championship. So no, LeBron James did not start super teams, but he definitely helped popularize it. And with player movement becoming more frequent, common, and just all around socially acceptable, the idea of forming a super team will just continue to increase as time continues to progress. And because of this, I do believe it is time that someone sat down and actually defined what it means to have a super team. Because after the conversations that I saw on social media, after Russell Westbrook was traded to the Lakers, yeah, this video is definitely needed. Now, I could just sit here and say that a super team is a team that consists of 3 or more all-stars, and I would technically be correct. But that would not only be one of the laziest definitions of a super team, but more importantly, even though that definition may technically be right, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is inherently correct. Now, what exactly do I mean by that? See, on a super team, more than likely you will have 3 or more all-stars on your roster. However, just because you have 3 or more all-stars or 3 or more top 30 to 40 players on your team, that does not necessarily mean that you have a super team. Now, the reason why I highlight this is because top 30 and top 40 lists are extremely subjective from one person to the next, but more importantly, what it takes to be a top 30 player or what it takes to be an all-star is too broad of a spectrum to claim that just having 3 or more of them on your roster is enough to classify that team as a super team. Great examples of this are the 2015 Atlanta Hawks or the 2006 Detroit Pistons. 2 teams that had a lot of success in the regular season, made a deep postseason run, and indeed had 4 all-stars on their roster, which is extremely rare. Throughout NBA history, there have only been 10 teams that have had 4 players to actively make an all-star roster during the same season. And even with that being said, the 2006 Pistons nor the 2015 Atlanta Hawks are super teams. And the reason for this is the lack of the most important piece on a super team, and that is the superstar. Now, I am aware labeling a player a superstar is also very subjective. So a better way to put this is the most important piece to a super team has to be a perennial MVP caliber player. And having said player dramatically increases the odds that a team will make it deep into the playoffs. And that is irregardless of the teammates that you put around said player. Since 1991, there have been 124 teams to make the conference finals. Out of those 124 teams, 69 of them had at least one player who finished top 5 in the MVP race that year, which means that more than half of the teams to make a conference finals appearance in the past 31 years featured an MVP caliber player on their roster. And for the curious minds out there, within that same time frame, every single year in the finals, there was always at least one player who finished top 5 in the MVP race. So yeah, it's basically a necessity. If the whole premise of building a super team is to exponentially increase your odds of winning a championship, the only way that can be accomplished is if you have an MVP caliber player on your roster.
Wait a minute, Lo. You're telling me that 2014 Joakim Noah can be the best player on a super team because he finished top 4 in the MVP race that season? Ha, I think not.
No, I'm not saying that. Like I said before, this is a perennial MVP caliber player, meaning that for 3, 4, 5+ years at a time, this is a player who can finish top 5 or top 7 in the MVP race on a year-to-year basis. And not those single season sensations. No shots to Paul George, Isaiah Thomas, Joakim Noah, and Jermaine O'Neal, because yes, there is a season where Jermaine O'Neal finished top 5 in the MVP race. However, the caliber of player that I'm referencing to is a player who can guarantee you, regardless of the circumstances that they find themselves in, that they can consistently play at that level. Now, the second piece that is needed is a perennial All-NBA caliber player. Now, of course, this is just the natural regression from an MVP caliber player. However, it is important to identify and make the distinction for this player, and I'll talk about that later on. But before I get too ahead of myself, as we all know, all NBA caliber players can post up very impressive numbers and also have pivotal impact to their team's success. Outside of a few players here and there, on a year-to-year basis, overwhelmingly majority of the players who are selected on an All-NBA team are in the playoffs. And also, for a year or two in their peak, All-NBA caliber players can potentially play on MVP levels as well. But of course, the difference between the All-NBA player and the MVP caliber player is how consistently they can play on that level. And if you do believe it's still hard to identify the difference between the two caliber players, well, most of the time the difference is highlighted in the postseason. However, the biggest distinction that I want to make with the All-NBA caliber player isn't necessarily with the MVP caliber player, but with the third piece that you need to have on a super team, which is the perennial all-star caliber player. Again, I think this more or less speaks for itself, but the difference between an All-NBA caliber player and an all-star caliber player is that an all-star is one of the best players at his position in his conference, whereas an All-NBA caliber player is one of the best players at his position in the entire league. And again, if the whole premise of building a super team is to win a championship, just being one of the better players in the conference might not be enough if the gap between one conference to the next is that significant. The best example in what I immediately go to when I'm trying to depict what I'm referring to is the 2015 season. If you look at the MVP race, LeBron James was the only Eastern Conference player to receive a single vote. Also, when you look at the All-NBA teams, LeBron James, Pau Gasol, and Kyrie Irving are the only 3 Eastern Conference representatives who was able to fill out one of the 15 slots on the All-NBA teams. So even though, yes, the Atlanta Hawks, they had 4 All-Stars, it is completely clear that the bar was set significantly lower for what was deemed as elite talent in the Eastern Conference in contrast to the Western Conference. So, now that I've highlighted the 3 core pieces that are necessary for any roster to be labeled a super team, I finally have to bring light to the #1 rule that I think a lot of people casually overlook. A rule that will end any loophole that many people find themselves trapped in when having these conversations with others. And that one and only rule is those 3 players have to be playing at that level while on the team with one another, which is extremely pivotal to this conversation. I have cringed way too many times when I've heard people try to make arguments that X team somehow is a super team, even though all of their stars are significantly way past their prime. Sure, a team with Scottie Pippen, Charles Barkley, and Hakeem Olajuwon sounds great, but when you put into context that Hakeem was 36, Barkley was 35, and Pippen was 32, and more importantly, Hakeem and Barkley were no longer playing at MVP levels, and with that proper context, no one would then dare to label that roster a super team. But possibly a more controversial team are the 2014 Miami Heat, where even though yes, LeBron was still playing at an MVP level, and yes, Chris Bosh was still at an all-star status, D Wade had regressed as a player and he was no longer performing at All-NBA heights. So even though you may have been accustomed to viewing that trio as being a lead to a super team, once D Wade got older and started regressing due to injuries and wasn't able to perform at that heights, the guaranteed level of success that is needed for a core to be labeled a super team was no longer there. And with that in mind, it really brings us back to the original question that many people want to answer. If you look at my classifications on what is necessary for a unit to be labeled a super team, all of the super teams in NBA history would easily apply. The 80s Boston Celtics, the Showtime Lakers, the 96 Chicago Bulls, the 2008 Boston Celtics, the 2012 Miami Heat, and of course in recent history, the Golden State Warriors, just to name a few. However, to truly answer the question that was proposed in the beginning of the video, I think we have to actually look at failed super teams. The concept of a super team failing is so oxymoronic that it forces me to dig a little bit deeper and try to figure out how this happens. And outside of the occasional one super team just losing to another super team, and also we have to take into consideration injuries, majority of the time when a super team fails, it's because one of the three core pieces were not playing at the level that people expected them to play at. Great example is the 2018 Oklahoma City Thunder. Russell Westbrook is coming off an MVP caliber year, so he's expected to be the MVP caliber player. Paul George in Indiana proved that he had quality All-NBA seasons, but could not take the next step to be the MVP caliber player that Indiana desperately needed, so he was expected to fulfill the All-NBA role with the Thunder. And now you have Carmelo Anthony, who even at an advanced age has proven that he can consistently perform at an all-star level, so expecting him to do so for the Thunder was a bit of a no-brainer, but unfortunately it still didn't work out for them. We can all debate and argue if Russell Westbrook actually performed at an MVP level, especially with his postseason production, but the biggest drop-off in production was Carmelo Anthony, who was not able to meet the expectations of performing as an all-star. And because of this, the reason why people view the 2018 Oklahoma City Thunder as a failed super team is because our expectations of them were to perform at that level and they failed miserably. But if I had told you before the season began, Carmelo Anthony, the historically great volume scorer who consistently scored 20 plus points every year of his career up until that moment, would only average 16 points on the worst shooting efficiency of his career, being massive negative defensively, and there were conversations about how he should be coming off the bench rather than starting, more than likely before the season began, you would not have viewed that team as a super team. Which brings us to the 2021 Lakers. Look, I believe a healthy LeBron, even at this stage of his career, can play at an MVP level because he was literally just doing it before he got hurt in the middle of last season. So I'm not really concerned about that. But even if he does decide to take a lesser role to best benefit this team, Anthony Davis can easily fulfill the MVP caliber role on this team while LeBron regresses to an All-NBA level. So my questions and concerns aren't for those two, it's actually for Westbrook. Now, on the surface, if you ask yourself, can Westbrook play at an all-star level as the third best player on a team? And I believe most people would say that's a no-brainer. He obviously can do so. And to be transparent, I would be one of those people as well. However, as we all know, it's not as simple as that. You can't just throw a whole bunch of talented players together and believe that it's going to work out to the tune of a super team. And that is the reason why I highlighted the 2018 Oklahoma City Thunder. At that stage of his career, I'm pretty sure Carmelo Anthony could still perform at an all-star level. However, on a team that probably wasn't the best fit for him, his production dropped to a point where he no longer qualified for that status. And I fear that could potentially happen to Westbrook as well. Because if we want to be honest with ourselves, Westbrook for basically all of his career has been on rosters that best benefited his style of play. Offenses that allow Westbrook to be a ball dominant player, dictate pace, and supporting cast members that were not only willing to play their role, but benefited significantly from Westbrook's style of play. But honestly, I don't know if that's a team that we see Westbrook on this upcoming year. LeBron is a much better decision maker, so you more than likely will want to have the ball in his hands. Westbrook as a finisher has regressed noticeably over the past 3 to 5 years, so putting him on a team that features LeBron, AD, and Dwight Howard again might bring up some problems, and more importantly, Westbrook just is not a floor spacer. So the possibility that Westbrook just won't be the best fit for this team can lend the argument to why this team will end the season as a failed super team, even though they probably should have never received a label as a super team to begin with. But hey, those are just my thoughts and a bit of an NBA theory on my view on what is considered a super team. And please let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, because I know for a fact everything I said in this video isn't picture perfect, so I'm definitely going to receive a lot of opinions down low, and that's fine. And if you don't do that, make sure to subscribe button, notification bell, and I'll see you all next time. Peace.